I told my mother I hated her. Then she never woke up again. The sterile scent of antiseptic, a smell I'd come to associate with hushed anxieties and forced smiles, clung to the air like a damp shroud. It was the smell of waiting, of lives held in fragile suspension, and for the first time, I was on the wrong side of the glass. My mother lay behind it, a landscape of tubes and monitors charting the silent territory of her unconsciousness. The words, a venomous cascade I'd spewed in a moment of raw, unadulterated anger, echoed in the cavernous space of my own guilt. I hate you. The phrase, so carelessly hurled, now felt like a physical blow, a brand seared onto my soul. It was the last thing I'd said to her, a parting shot in a petty argument over something I couldn't even recall now, a triviality swallowed whole by the enormity of what had followed. The room was small, painted a pale institutional green that did nothing to soften the stark reality. A single chair, hard and unforgiving, was my domain. Outside, the relentless hum of the hospital was a constant reminder of the world continuing, oblivious to the seismic shift that had occurred within my own. I traced the worn pattern on the armrest, each groove a testament to countless hours of vigil, of hopes and fears whispered into the unhearing air. My mother, a woman who had weathered storms I couldn't even comprehend, was now adrift in a sea I had no map to navigate. Her silence was a deafening accusation, a void where her laughter, her scolding, her unwavering presence used to be. It had been a Tuesday. Tuesdays were usually quiet, uneventful. I'd come home from work, tired, irritable, carrying the accumulated frustrations of a day spent navigating a world that felt increasingly indifferent. She'd been in the kitchen, humming a tune I vaguely recognized, the scent of her baking, a familiar comfort, usually a balm to my frayed nerves. But that day, something was different. A tension, subtle yet palpable, coiled between us. It started, as it often did, with a seemingly innocuous question, a gentle inquiry about my day. But my own internal landscape was a battlefield, and her words, however well-intentioned, landed on fertile ground of resentment. I don't remember the exact trigger, the spark that ignited the inferno. Perhaps it was a perceived slight, a misunderstanding, a lifetime of unspoken grievances that finally found their voice. But the words came, hot and sharp, tearing through the quiet domesticity of the afternoon. They were ugly, laced with a bitterness I hadn't known I possessed, a raw, untamed anger that felt both alien and terrifyingly familiar. My mother, usually so resilient, so unflappable, had flinched. I saw it in the sudden stillness of her hands, the way her shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly, but I was too consumed by my own tempest to register the depth of the wound I was inflicting. I pushed, fueled by a reckless disregard for consequence, each word a stone thrown with deliberate force, and then the final devastating pronouncement, "I hate you." It hung in the air, a noxious cloud, before I turned and walked out, leaving her standing there, a solitary figure bathed in the harsh afternoon light. The slam of the front door was a punctuation mark, a definitive end to the conversation, a severance I never imagined would be so permanent. I drove, the city lights blurring into streaks of color, the radio a low, thrumming distraction. I told myself I needed space, time to cool down, to regain control. I told myself it was just a fight, that we'd talk it through later, that the bond between a mother and child was too strong to be broken by a few harsh words. Hours later, the phone call shattered that fragile illusion. A neighbor, concerned by the unusual silence, had found her. The details were a blur of medical jargon and hushed tones. A stroke, sudden, severe, the ambulance, the frantic rush to the hospital, the cold efficiency of the emergency room. And now, this waiting room, this sterile smell, this crushing weight of regret. My mother, the anchor of my life, lay still, her breath shallow, her future hanging precariously in the balance. And I, the architect of this agonizing silence, was left to confront the ghost of my own cruelty. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. In my desperate attempt to assert my independence, I had severed the very connection that defined me. The world outside continued its indifferent spin, but my world had stopped, frozen in the echo of those three terrible words. The fluorescent lights of the waiting room hummed, a monotonous drone that did little to drown out the frantic beat of my own heart. Each tick of the clock on the wall felt like a hammer blow against my ribs. I watched a nurse, her face a mask of professional calm, move through the hallway, her footsteps soft on the linoleum. She carried a tray, the clinking of its contents a small, sharp sound in the pervasive quiet. I tried to focus on the mundane details, the way the light caught the dust motes dancing in the air, the faint scent of disinfectant that did nothing to mask the underlying, undeniable odor of sickness, anything to avoid the gnawing emptiness that had taken root in my gut. My mother's room. I peered through the small glass window in the door, my breath fogging the surface. She lay there, a fragile silhouette against the white sheets, her face serene in its stillness, yet etched with a vulnerability that tore at me. Her hand, usually so warm and firm, lay limp at her side, a network of tubes snaking from beneath the crisp linen. The rhythmic beep of the monitor was a steady, insistent pulse, a lifeline I prayed would never falter. I'd rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in my head, imagining a tearful reunion, a heartfelt apology, a desperate plea for forgiveness. But the reality was far more stark, far more silent. There was no response, no flicker of recognition, just the quiet hum of machines and the heavy stillness of sleep. The argument, the one that had ended with my hateful words, replayed itself in my mind, a relentless, torturous loop. It had been over something so insignificant, so utterly trivial, a forgotten errand, a misplaced item. The details were hazy, lost in the fog of my own self-absorption. I remembered the rising tide of frustration, the tight knot in my chest, the way her gentle persistence had felt like an accusation. I'd felt cornered, misunderstood, and in my childish pique, I'd lashed out, wielding my words like weapons, aiming for the softest parts of her heart. "I hate you," I'd spat, the words tasting like ash in my mouth even as they left my lips. And then, the abrupt departure, the slamming door, the definitive end to our exchange. I had stormed out, convinced of my own righteousness, oblivious to the precipice I was pushing us both towards. The days that followed were a blur of forced normalcy. I went through the motions, a hollow shell of my former self. I'd call home, my voice carefully modulated, asking about her day, about dinner, about the mundane rhythm of her life. She'd answer, her voice steady as if nothing had happened, as if the venom I'd injected hadn't poisoned the air between us. But I knew. And she knew. The unspoken hung heavy, a constant, suffocating presence. I avoided her gaze, unable to meet the gentle disappointment I imagined I would find there. I was a coward, hiding from the consequences of my own actions, clinging to the illusion that I could outrun the inevitable. Then came the phone call that ripped that illusion to shreds. A frantic voice on the other end of the line, a jumble of words I struggled to comprehend. A fall, an ambulance, the hospital, the sterile scent, the hushed tones, the sterile green walls. It all coalesced into a single horrifying reality. She was gone. Not dead, not yet, but lost. Adrift in a silent world, her consciousness a distant shore I could no longer reach. The words I had so carelessly thrown, the ones I thought were just a temporary storm, had become a permanent eclipse. The weight of my regret was a physical burden, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. Every beat of the monitor was a reminder of my failure, a testament to the irreversible damage I had wrought. I sat by her bedside, the hard plastic chair a familiar discomfort. The room was bathed in the soft, diffused light of early morning, the shadows slowly receding, revealing the details of her still form. Her breathing was shallow, each inhale a whisper, each exhale a sigh. The tubes, once an alien intrusion, now seemed like extensions of her very being, delicate threads connecting her to the world of the living. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and gently touched her hand. It was cool, almost cold, but beneath the surface I felt a faint pulse, a fragile tremor of life. I traced the lines on her palm, lines that had soothed my scraped knees, that had held mine as we walked, that had always been there, a constant, unwavering presence, the memory of our last real conversation, the one that had ended in bitterness, was a raw wound. I'd been defensive, prideful, unwilling to admit any fault. She tried, as she always did, to bridge the gap, to offer understanding, to steer me towards a calmer path. But I'd been a raging storm, my own insecurities and frustrations blinding me to her love. The words, "I hate you," had burst from me like shrapnel, a cruel and unnecessary finality. I'd meant them in the heat of the moment, a desperate, misguided attempt to push her away, to protect myself from what I perceived as judgment. But the words, once spoken, took on a life of their own, echoing in the sudden, stunned silence that followed. Her response, or rather, her lack of one, had been more devastating than any shouted retort. A quiet sigh, a subtle withdrawal, a look in her eyes that spoke volumes of hurt, of disappointment. It was in that moment I now realized that a part of her had begun to recede, a slow, almost imperceptible drift away from the shore of connection. I'd walked away from that argument, carrying a hollow victory, a sense of righteous indignation that now felt like a shroud of shame. I'd convinced myself that she, with her infinite capacity for forgiveness, would simply let it go, that our bond was unbreakable. But the universe, it seemed, had a different plan. The phone call that had brought me here, to this antiseptic-scented purgatory, had delivered the brutal truth. A fall, a blood clot. The words had tumbled out, a panicked cascade of medical terms that painted a grim picture. And now she lay here, caught between worlds, her fate a question mark hanging heavy in the air. The beeping of the machines, once a distant hum, was now the soundtrack to my own internal torment. Each pulse was a reminder of the preciousness of time, of the opportunities I had squandered, of the words left unsaid, of the apologies never offered. I watched as a nurse adjusted a drip, her movements precise and practiced. The only sound was the gentle whir of machinery and the soft rustle of fabric. I wanted to reach out, to ask her to do something, anything to wake my mother, to erase the hateful words I had spoken. But what could she do? What could anyone do? This was a consequence I had to face, a debt I had to pay, not with money or with grand gestures, but with the quiet, agonizing currency of waiting and regret. The room, once a place of sterile efficiency, now felt like a crucible, forging me in the fires of my own making. I was trapped in the aftermath of my own making, a spectator to the slow unraveling of a life I had taken for granted. The silence in the room was a tangible thing, a heavy blanket that muffled the outside world. Sunlight, diffused by the blinds, painted stripes across the pale green walls, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the still air. My mother lay motionless, her chest rising and falling with the shallow rhythm of the ventilator. Her face, usually so animated, so full of life, was now a mask of profound stillness, her lips slightly parted as if about to speak, but holding only breath. I watched the subtle rise and fall, a fragile testament to the life force that still clung to her. The lines etched around her eyes, once a map of laughter and worry, now seemed deeper, more pronounced in repose. I reached out, my fingers hovering inches above her skin, afraid to disturb the delicate equilibrium. The memory of my last words to her, "I hate you," clawed at my throat, a physical manifestation of my shame. It was a phrase I'd uttered in a moment of blinding, adolescent rage, a desperate, misguided attempt to assert independence, to push away the perceived judgment I'd felt from her quiet disapproval of my choices. The argument itself had been a blur of accusations and defensiveness, fueled by my own insecurities and her unwavering, perhaps too persistent concern. I'd felt cornered, misunderstood, and in that primal surge of emotion, I'd unleashed the harshest words I could conjure. The immediate aftermath of that argument had been a chilling silence, a void where her usual gentle persistence, or at worst, a firm reprimand, would have been. Instead, she'd simply looked at me, a profound sadness settling in her eyes, and then turned away. It was that look, more than any shouted word, that had begun to chip away at my bravado. I'd walked away from her house that day with a hollow victory, a sense of self-righteousness that quickly soured into a gnawing unease. I'd told myself it was just a fight, that she'd understand, that our bond was too strong to be fractured by a few careless words. But the universe had a crueler way of teaching lessons. The phone call, the frantic voice on the other end, the cascade of medical terms, a fall, a head injury, complications. The details had been a jumbled nightmare, the reality of which had only truly settled in when I'd seen her here, hooked up to machines, her life hanging by a thread I had helped to fray. The beeping of the heart monitor was a constant, agonizing reminder of the preciousness of breath, of the irreversible nature of my actions. Each pulse felt like a judgment, a stark counterpoint to the silence I had imposed upon her. A nurse entered, her presence a gentle disruption. She moved with quiet efficiency, checking monitors, adjusting tubes, her face a study in compassionate professionalism. I watched her, a silent observer in this intimate space, feeling like an intruder in my own mother's final moments. She offered me a small, knowing smile, a silent acknowledgement of the shared human experience of loss and love. I wanted to confess, to unload the burden of my guilt, but the words caught in my throat, choked by a profound sense of inadequacy. What apology could possibly suffice for words spoken with such venom, words that had perhaps hastened this very stillness? The weight of my regret was a physical ache, a constant pressure behind my eyes. I thought of all the times she had been there for me, her unwavering support a bedrock in my often turbulent life, her quiet strength, her boundless patience, her ability to see the good in me even when I struggled to see it myself. And I had repaid her with hate. The irony was a bitter, searing truth. In my desperate, misguided attempt to create distance, I had forged an unbreakable, agonizing bond of consequence. The silence in the room was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a presence, a heavy, suffocating entity born from my own cruelty. I sat for what felt like hours, the world outside receding into a distant hum. The sunlight shifted, casting longer shadows, the stripes on the wall slowly merging. My mother's hand, still cool and still, lay on the crisp white sheet. I finally gathered the courage, my hand trembling, to gently place my own over hers. Her skin was soft, almost translucent, the veins like delicate blue rivers beneath the surface. A faint warmth, a subtle flicker of life, seemed to emanate from her. It was a fragile connection, a whisper of the life that had once pulsed with such vibrant energy. A nurse entered, her footsteps barely audible on the polished floor. She moved with a practiced grace, her face etched with a gentle weariness that spoke of countless vigils. She offered a small, almost imperceptible nod, a shared understanding passing between us in the sterile quiet. I felt a surge of something akin to gratitude for her quiet presence, a silent witness to my grief. I wanted to speak, to pour out the torrent of regret and apology that threatened to consume me. But the words felt inadequate, clumsy, incapable of bridging the chasm I had created. Then a subtle shift, a faint flutter beneath my fingertips. My mother's thumb, almost imperceptibly, twitched. It was a minuscule movement, easily missed, but to me it was a seismic event. My breath hitched. I squeezed her hand gently, a silent question, a desperate plea. Her eyelids fluttered, a slow, hesitant movement, like curtains drawn back on a darkened stage. The rhythmic beeping of the monitor seemed to intensify, a frantic drumbeat against the silence. Her eyes opened, not fully, but enough to reveal a sliver of hazy blue, clouded with the residue of sleep and something else. Confusion, perhaps, or a dawning awareness. She didn't focus on me, not immediately. Her gaze drifted, unfocused, across the room, taking in the sterile walls, the humming machines, the unfamiliar surroundings. But then slowly, agonizingly, her gaze settled on me. There was no anger, no accusation, only a profound weariness, a deep, unfathomable sadness. And in that moment, as our eyes met, the carefully constructed walls of my denial crumbled. The hateful words I had hurled at her, the venom I had spewed, felt like a physical weight crushing me. I saw not just my mother, but a woman, frail and vulnerable, who had loved me unconditionally and whom I had wounded with a cruelty I could barely comprehend. Tears, hot and stinging, welled in my eyes, blurring her image. I couldn't speak, couldn't articulate the depth of my remorse. All I could do was hold her hand, a silent, desperate offering of apology, of love, of a desperate plea for a forgiveness I knew I didn't deserve. She didn't speak. Her eyes, still clouded but holding a flicker of recognition, remained fixed on mine. A single tear traced a path down her weathered cheek, a silent testament to the pain I had inflicted. I felt a profound shift within me, a shattering of my self-absorption, a dawning awareness of the impact of my actions. The world, which had seemed so focused on my own grievances, suddenly expanded, revealing the fragile interconnectedness of human hearts. My own tears fell freely now, hot and cleansing. I squeezed her hand, a silent promise forming in the depths of my soul. The anger, the pride, the defensiveness, they all dissolved, leaving behind a raw, aching vulnerability. I saw her not as an antagonist, but as a fellow traveler, someone who had navigated her own storms, who deserved kindness, compassion, and respect. The sterile air in the room, once suffocating, now felt charged with a quiet understanding. Her gaze softened, a flicker of something akin to peace replacing the sadness. Her thumb, still resting in my palm, gave another faint twitch. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but it resonated with a profound significance. It was a bridge, a fragile connection re-established across the chasm of my own making. I held her hand tighter, not in possession, but in a silent vow to cherish, to protect, to never again allow my own darkness to dim the light of another. The beeping of the monitor, once a source of terror, now sounded like a steady heartbeat, a rhythm of hope. The weight on my chest began to lift, replaced by a quiet, almost reverent sorrow. The harsh edges of my regret softened, transforming into a deep, abiding ache that felt less like punishment and more like a profound lesson learned. I stayed there, holding her hand, breathing in the sterile air, feeling the gentle rhythm of her breath against my own. The world outside the room, with its demands and its noise, faded into insignificance. Here, in this quiet space, a fundamental truth had been revealed, not through grand pronouncements or analytical dissection, but through the raw, undeniable language of a human heart, finally beginning to mend. She stirred again, a faint sigh escaping her lips. Her eyes, still hazy, found mine, and for a fleeting moment a spark of recognition of something almost like a gentle smile touched her lips. It was a fragile moment, fleeting, but it was enough. It was an acknowledgement, a silent acceptance that transcended words, a shared understanding that pulsed between us. The world outside, with its relentless demands, felt distant, irrelevant. Here, in the quiet hum of the machines, a profound transformation was taking place, not in her, but in me. The harshness had been stripped away, leaving behind a raw, exposed core of empathy. I held her hand, the coolness of her skin a stark contrast to the warmth spreading through my chest. The hateful words I had spoken, once a searing brand, now felt like faded scars, reminders of a past I could not change but could learn from. The quiet rhythm of her breathing, the steady beep of the monitor, became a new kind of lullaby, a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit and the quiet, persistent power of love. The air, thick with the scent of antiseptic, now carried a faint undertone of something else, something akin to peace. A fragile hope blooming in the barren landscape of my regret. She turned her head slightly, her gaze lingering on my face. There was no judgment, no anger, only a deep, quiet understanding that seemed to emanate from her very being. It was a look that spoke of a lifetime of love, of forgiveness offered even before it was asked, of a bond that transcended the spoken word. In that shared gaze, the chasm I had created began to close, filled not with explanations or apologies, but with a silent, profound connection. The world had shifted, not with a bang, but with the quiet grace of a heart finally opening. The weight of my past actions remained, a somber reminder of the fragility of connection and the devastating power of careless words. Yet it no longer felt like an insurmountable burden. Instead, it was a quiet knowing, a deep-seated understanding that had been forged in the crucible of regret. I had come seeking absolution, but I found something far more profound. A quiet awakening, a gentle unfolding of empathy that had been dormant within me for far too long. The silent understanding in her eyes was a balm to my wounded soul. It wasn't about forgiveness in the traditional sense, but about a deeper recognition of shared humanity, of the inherent value in every life, every connection. The sterile room, once a symbol of my failure, now felt like a sanctuary, a place where a fundamental truth had been laid bare. I had learned that love, in its purest form, is not about grand gestures or perfect words, but about the quiet act of presence, the simple, profound gesture of holding a hand, of bearing witness to another's journey. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a silent acknowledgement of the shared experience. It was not a tear of sorrow, but of release, of a quiet understanding that transcended the pain. In that moment, the world outside ceased to exist. There was only the gentle rhythm of her breath, the steady pulse of the monitor, and the profound, silent conversation unfolding between our hearts. The lesson was not etched in stone, but woven into the fabric of my being, a quiet whisper that would guide my steps forward. A faint smile touched her lips, a ghost of a memory, a flicker of the woman I knew and loved. It was a look that spoke volumes, a silent testament to a love that endured, a bond that even my own cruelty could not entirely sever. The sterile air seemed to shimmer with a newfound warmth, a quiet testament to the enduring power of human connection. A single, solitary tear rolled down her cheek. The faint tremor beneath my fingertips, a barely perceptible flutter of her thumb, ignited a jolt of something akin to disbelief, then sheer, unadulterated hope. It wasn't a grand gesture, no sudden surge of strength, but a subtle, almost unconscious movement, a whisper from a body caught in the throes of profound stillness. This small act, so seemingly insignificant, was a universe away from the echoing silence that had dominated the room. It was a tangible thread, a connection re-established, a stark contrast to the void my own words had carved. Now, consider how this subtle shift in her physical response profoundly altered my internal landscape. It wasn't the words of apology I had rehearsed, nor the reasoned explanations I had prepared, but this quiet, physical reassurance that began to dismantle the fortress of my guilt. Building on this nascent awareness, I noticed the subtle changes in the quality of her breath. It had been shallow, labored, a mechanical inhale and exhale dictated by the machine. But now, beneath the hum of the ventilator, there was a distinct, almost imperceptible softening. It was as if the very act of my presence, my focused attention, had somehow eased the tension in her lungs. This wasn't a medical intervention. It was a visceral response, a subtle testament to the unseen currents that flow between two beings, especially when one is pouring out their deepest remorse. It underscored the idea that healing, or at least the path towards it, can manifest in ways far subtler than dramatic pronouncements. Furthermore, the quality of light in the room seemed to shift, no longer harsh and clinical, but diffused, softer, as if the very atmosphere was responding to this delicate shift in energy. The stripes of sunlight, previously stark and unforgiving, now seemed to paint a gentler picture across the floor and walls. This wasn't a literal change in the sun's position, but a perceptual one, a reflection of my own internal recalibration. My focus had moved from the crushing weight of my past actions to the fragile present, to the almost imperceptible signs of my mother's slow return. This shift in perception allowed me to see beyond the immediate crisis, to glimpse the possibility of a future, however altered. Consequently, the constant rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, which had previously felt like an accusatory drumbeat against my failure, began to transform. It became less a reminder of what was broken and more a steady, persistent affirmation of life. Each pulse was a declaration, a quiet insistence that despite the damage, despite the darkness, life persisted. This was not about negating the gravity of the situation, but about reframing my relationship to it, moving from a place of paralyzing guilt to one of hopeful vigilance. Conversely, the sterile scent of antiseptic, which had been a constant oppressive reminder of illness and despair, began to recede in my awareness. It was still present, of course, but it was no longer the dominant sensory input. My attention was now captivated by the minute details of my mother's physical presence, the faint warmth radiating from her hand, the almost imperceptible flutter of her eyelids, the subtle shift in her breathing. These became the new anchors, grounding me in the present and offering a quiet counterpoint to the overwhelming memories of my past harshness. This redirection of sensory focus was a crucial step in moving beyond the immediate emotional fallout. Another crucial layer is the dawning realization that my initial confession, the hateful words, had been a desperate, albeit misguided attempt to assert a sense of control in a situation where I felt utterly powerless. My mother's unwavering presence, her gentle guidance, had always been a source of comfort, but in my adolescent rebellion, it had also felt like a subtle constraint. The words, therefore, were not just an expression of anger, but a clumsy, destructive bid for autonomy. Understanding this offered a different lens through which to view my actions, not excusing them, but contextualizing them within the complex landscape of a young person's struggle for identity. This deeper understanding was paving the way for a more genuine form of remorse, one rooted in insight rather than mere regret. The subtle tremor beneath my fingertips, a barely perceptible flutter of her thumb, ignited a jolt of something akin to disbelief, then sheer, unadulterated hope. It wasn't a grand gesture, no sudden surge of strength, but a subtle, almost unconscious movement, a whisper from a body caught in the throes of profound stillness. This small act, so seemingly insignificant, was a universe away from the echoing silence that had dominated the room. It was a tangible thread, a connection re-established, a stark contrast to the void my own words had carved. Now, consider how this subtle shift in her physical response profoundly altered my internal landscape. It wasn't the words of apology I had rehearsed, nor the reasoned explanations I had prepared, but this quiet, physical reassurance that began to dismantle the fortress of my guilt. Building on this nascent awareness, I noticed the subtle changes in the quality of her breath. It had been shallow, labored, a mechanical inhale and exhale dictated by the machine. But now, beneath the hum of the ventilator, there was a distinct, almost imperceptible softening. It was as if the very act of my presence, my focused attention, had somehow eased the tension in her lungs. This wasn't a medical intervention. It was a visceral response, a subtle testament to the unseen currents that flow between two beings, especially when one is pouring out their deepest remorse. It underscored the idea that healing, or at least the path towards it, can manifest in ways far subtler than dramatic pronouncements. Furthermore, the quality of light in the room seemed to shift, no longer harsh and clinical, but diffused, softer, as if the very atmosphere was responding to this delicate shift in energy. The stripes of sunlight, previously stark and unforgiving, now seemed to paint a gentler picture across the floor and walls. This wasn't a literal change in the sun's position, but a perceptual one, a reflection of my own internal recalibration. My focus had moved from the crushing weight of my past actions to the fragile present, to the almost imperceptible signs of my mother's slow return. This shift in perception allowed me to see beyond the immediate crisis, to glimpse the possibility of a future, however altered. Consequently, the constant rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, which had previously felt like an accusatory drumbeat against my failure, began to transform. It became less a reminder of what was broken and more a steady, persistent affirmation of life. Each pulse was a declaration, a quiet insistence that despite the damage, despite the darkness, life persisted. This was not about negating the gravity of the situation, but about reframing my relationship to it, moving from a place of paralyzing guilt to one of hopeful vigilance. Conversely, the sterile scent of antiseptic, which had been a constant oppressive reminder of illness and despair, began to recede in my awareness. It was still present, of course, but it was no longer the dominant sensory input. My attention was now captivated by the minute details of my mother's physical presence, the faint warmth radiating from her hand, the almost imperceptible flutter of her eyelids, the subtle shift in her breathing. These became the new anchors, grounding me in the present and offering a quiet counterpoint to the overwhelming memories of my past harshness. This redirection of sensory focus was a crucial step in moving beyond the immediate emotional fallout. Another crucial layer is the dawning realization that my initial confession, the hateful words, had been a desperate, albeit misguided attempt to assert a sense of control in a situation where I felt utterly powerless. My mother's unwavering presence, her gentle guidance, had always been a source of comfort, but in my adolescent rebellion, it had also felt like a subtle constraint. The words, therefore, were not just an expression of anger, but a clumsy, destructive bid for autonomy. Understanding this offered a different lens through which to view my actions, not excusing them, but contextualizing them within the complex landscape of a young person's struggle for identity. This deeper understanding was paving the way for a more genuine form of remorse, one rooted in insight rather than mere regret. Building on this burgeoning self-awareness, the subtle change in my mother's gaze, from a hazy, unfocused look to one that held a flicker of recognition, became the next significant marker. It wasn't a sudden, sharp clarity, but a gradual softening, a gradual emergence from the fog. Imagine looking through a smudged window and slowly, painstakingly wiping away the grime. Each passing moment brought a clearer view, a more defined image. This gradual return of focus was not a passive event. It felt like a response, a quiet acknowledgement that the connection, however strained, was still there, waiting to be rekindled. Consequently, the sterile scent of the hospital room, which had previously been an almost overwhelming sensory assault, began to fade into the background. My senses were now acutely attuned to the more intimate details of my mother's presence. The faint warmth emanating from her hand, the subtle tremor in her fingers, the almost imperceptible shift in her breathing. These were the new sensory anchors, grounding me in the profound reality of the moment, pulling my attention away from the abstract weight of my past failures and anchoring it firmly in the tangible present. The true practice begins now, in the quiet moments, in the everyday interactions, in the conscious choice to extend the empathy that bloomed in this sterile room. It is in the mindful pause before speaking, the deliberate act of listening, the quiet acknowledgement of another's unseen struggles. This awakening is not a destination, but a continuous unfolding, a gentle commitment to seeing the world and ourselves with a more tender, more understanding gaze. The scars remain, not as marks of shame, but as reminders of the profound lessons learned, the quiet strength found in vulnerability, and the enduring power of a heart that has finally begun to truly see.